The rancher found an injured Apache girl in the pines, and one night changed everything. John Harper, a man in his late 40s with sun-weathered skin and strong hands, was making his usual rounds through the fields and hills that he had tended for most of his life. The ranch had always been quiet, the kind of place where the wind through the trees was a constant companion, and the soft lowing of cattle created a rhythm that John had come to know like a heartbeat. He enjoyed the solitude, the way the world seemed to slow down in the open spaces, and the satisfaction that came from knowing the land and animals depended on him. That day had started like any other. John had saddled his horse, Rusty, at dawn, and had set out to check the northern pastures where some of the younger calves were grazing. The air smelled of pine and earth, and a gentle breeze rustled the tall grass. Birds flitted from branch to branch, and the occasional deer could be seen in the distance. Everything seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful, which made John's trained instincts sharpen. He had learned over the years that the quietest moments often hid surprises. As he rode along a narrow trail that wound through a cluster of dense pines, he noticed something unusual. A faint sound reached his ears, almost like a whisper carried by the wind, but there was a tension in it, a trembling note that made John pause. He listened closely, turning his head to catch the source. There it was again, a small, almost fragile cry. It wasn't the sound of any animal he knew, and the worry that sprang up in his chest was immediate and instinctive. Something was wrong. John urged Rusty toward the sound, the horse moving carefully over the uneven ground. As he drew closer, the cries grew louder, but still weak and fearful. The pines thickened, and the light of the setting sun filtered through the branches, casting long, trembling shadows on the forest floor. The sight that greeted him left him momentarily stunned. There, beneath a large pine, was a girl, sitting on the ground with her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked no older than 12 or 13, her dark hair tangled with pine needles, and her clothes torn and dirt-streaked. Her small body was bruised and scraped, and she shivered slightly in the cool evening air. One leg was bent at an awkward angle, and she leaned heavily to one side, unable to stand properly. Her wide eyes, dark and wary, met John's as he approached. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The fear and pain in those eyes spoke volumes, telling him that this child had been through a great ordeal. John dismounted slowly, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. He didn't want to startle her. "Hey there," he said gently, his voice steady but soft. "It's all right, you're safe now." The girl flinched at his words, shrinking back against the tree. She didn't speak, only shaking her head slightly, her eyes darting around as if searching for someone or something that might be threatening her. John's heart ached at the sight. He could tell she had been alone for a long time, exposed to the elements and unsure if anyone could be trusted. Carefully, he moved closer, crouching a few feet away so as not to overwhelm her. "My name's John. I live just down the trail. You don't have to be afraid." He extended a hand slowly, palm open. "I can help you. Will you let me help you?" For several long moments, the girl did not respond. She just watched him, her chest rising and falling quickly as she tried to steady her breathing. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she allowed herself to be touched. It was barely perceptible, a trembling movement as she took his hand. John felt her small, fragile fingers slip into his, and he knew he had gained a measure of trust. Gently, he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, and he could feel the tension in her body slowly easing as he carried her back toward the trail. Rusty stood patiently, as if understanding the seriousness of the situation, and John swung up onto the horse, holding the girl carefully in front of him. The ride back to the ranch was slow and deliberate. Every bump in the trail reminded him of the injuries she must be carrying, and he made sure to move as smoothly as possible. By the time they reached the ranch house, the sky had turned a deep orange, the last rays of the sun spilling over the hills. John placed the girl gently on a clean blanket in the corner of the living room, where the fire he had prepared earlier cast a warm, comforting glow. She curled into a small ball, her eyes wide and cautious. John brought her a cup of water, which she drank slowly, and a simple meal of bread and stew. She ate quietly, never looking directly at him, but the small movements, the way she reached for the food, the way she wrapped her hands around the cup, told John she was beginning to feel safe, if only slightly. As the evening deepened, John sat near the fire, keeping a careful watch. He didn't want her to feel alone, and he didn't want to rush her into speaking before she was ready. The ranch, usually quiet at night except for the gentle sounds of animals settling down, seemed to hum with anticipation. Every crackle of the fire and rustle outside the windows was amplified in the tense silence, and John found himself imagining all the possibilities of what could have happened to this girl. He learned her name was Nina, though she said it quietly, almost as if speaking it aloud made her vulnerable. She did not yet explain how she had ended up in the pines, or why she had been alone and hurt. John didn't press her. He understood that trust could not be forced. He only offered comfort, warmth, and the sense that she was no longer alone. Throughout the night, John tended to her injuries as best he could. He cleaned her scrapes, applied salve to her cuts, and bandaged her leg with careful hands. Every motion was deliberate and gentle, because he knew the girl had experienced fear and pain far beyond what she should have. And yet, despite her exhaustion, she did not cry. She simply watched him with wide, uncertain eyes, and John sensed that in her. There was both fear and an unspoken resilience that would not easily be broken. By the time midnight came, Nina had fallen into a light, restless sleep. John remained awake, sitting by the fire, reflecting on the day's events. He had rescued many animals in his life, had cared for neighbors and friends, but never had he encountered a human life so delicate and so in need of protection. The ranch, which had always been a place of routine, of quiet hard work and steady living, now felt transformed. It was no longer just a home. It was a sanctuary, a place where trust could grow, where a young girl could find safety and warmth. And as John gazed into the fire, listening to the soft breathing of Nina, he realized that this encounter was not just about saving her. It was about connection, about understanding another life, about offering compassion without expectation. The night stretched on, long and quiet, and though danger and uncertainty still lingered in the world beyond the ranch, inside those walls, there was safety and there was hope. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, Nina was free from the cold and the fear that had followed her through the pines. And for John, the quiet ranch that he had always known was about to change in ways he could not yet imagine. The first part of their story had begun, and it began with a single act of courage, a single choice to care for someone in need, and a single night that would be remembered forever. Days passed slowly on the Harper Ranch, each one blending into the next with the steady rhythm of chores, animal care, and the quiet hum of life in the pines. John Harper continued to watch over Nina, the young Apache girl who had appeared unexpectedly in his life, bringing with her a mix of mystery, fear, and resilience. Though she was slowly recovering from her injuries, Nina remained quiet and distant, her dark eyes observing John and the ranch with a mixture of caution and curiosity. John understood that trust would not come quickly. He had learned over the years that fear often clung to those who had suffered, and patience was the key to helping them feel safe. He approached her gently each day, offering small gestures of kindness. He would bring her a warm meal at dawn when the world was quiet, and sometimes sit nearby, whittling a piece of wood or repairing a fence, speaking softly in the way one does when words are not fully understood but intentions are clear. At first, Nina did not speak much. She nodded when necessary, took the food he offered, and sometimes allowed him to help her clean her scrapes. But she avoided eye contact, keeping herself small and guarded. Her body seemed to carry not only the weight of her injuries, but also the invisible burden of fear, loneliness, and memories that were too heavy for a girl so young. John could see it in the way she flinched at sudden sounds or trembled when the wind shifted sharply through the trees. Determined to make her feel comfortable, John began to create small routines that could provide a sense of safety. Each morning, he would saddle Rusty and invite Nina to come with him, carrying her slowly on the horse so that she could see the ranch from a higher vantage point. At first, she hesitated, gripping him tightly and whispering words he could not understand. John only smiled gently and continued, knowing that familiarity would make her feel secure. After a few rides, she began to relax, looking out over the fields, the distant hills, and the cattle grazing peacefully in the open pastures. John also began to teach her small tasks around the ranch, things that were simple but gave her a sense of purpose. She learned to help with feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, and bringing water to the calves. Each small success brought a quiet glow of pride to her face, and John noticed her shoulders relaxing, her movements becoming less tense. He spoke to her calmly about each task, explaining slowly, showing patience as she repeated his instructions. He realized that even the smallest routines could bring comfort to a heart that had been so shaken. But it was not only physical comfort that Nina needed. John sensed that she was carrying stories, memories, and pain that could not be treated with bandages or food. At night, when the fire crackled warmly in the living room, he would sit nearby and tell her stories, not just tales of ranch life, but stories of courage, kindness, and the natural world. Sometimes he spoke of the stars, explaining how constellations could guide travelers and how the moon's light could protect those who wandered. Nina would listen quietly, her eyes wide and shining in the firelight, and occasionally she would ask questions in soft, hesitant tones. Language remained a barrier. Nina spoke in Apache, a melodic language John could not understand, while his English was foreign to her. Yet they began to find ways to communicate. Gestures, drawings in the dirt, and small objects became their tools of understanding. A smile could convey comfort. A hand on the shoulder could show reassurance. Slowly she began to repeat some English words, first simple ones like yes, no, and food, then small phrases, each attempt a step toward connection. John celebrated these victories quietly, knowing that trust and understanding could not be rushed. One afternoon, as they walked along the edge of the pine forest, John noticed Nina stopping frequently to look around, touching the bark of the trees and listening intently to the sounds of the wind. "Do you like the pines?" he asked gently. She nodded, brushing her fingers over the rough bark. There was a softness in her eyes he had not seen before, a flicker of curiosity replacing some of the fear. He realized that nature itself was becoming a bridge between them. The wind, the sun, the smell of earth and pine, these were universal comforts, and Nina seemed to draw strength from them. John began to point out animals, showing her how to follow tracks in the dirt, how to identify birds by their songs, and even how to tell when the weather was about to change. Nina listened carefully, asking questions in her quiet way, and the bond between them deepened. Yet even as trust grew, the past lingered. Nina would sometimes wake in the night, trembling, as if memories had returned to haunt her. John would sit by her side, wrapping a blanket around her small shoulders and speaking softly until she calmed. He never pressed her to talk, knowing that pain must be revealed on her own terms. Each night, he would watch her slowly drift back to sleep, grateful that, at least for these hours, she could rest without fear. In moments of quiet, John noticed the strength within her. Despite her fear and the hardship she had endured, there was resilience, intelligence, and courage in Nina that shone through her eyes. She began to experiment with small tasks on her own, carrying water to the chickens without instruction, climbing a gentle slope to watch the sunset, and even helping feed the calves with careful hands. John admired her determination, understanding that healing was not only about tending wounds, but also about nurturing confidence and independence. One particular evening stood out. A storm had rolled in, the sky dark and heavy, and rain began to patter on the roof of the ranch house. Nina had never experienced a storm like this in safety, and the sound frightened her. She hugged herself tightly, her eyes wide, and John knew he had to act. He took her hand gently and led her to the fireplace, where the warmth and light offered comfort against the cold and the noise. He told her stories about storms in the mountains, about how they passed and brought rain that nourished the land. He spoke in a calm, steady voice, never rushing, always patient. Slowly, Nina relaxed, leaning against him as the storm raged outside. That night, she slept more peacefully than she had in weeks. John also noticed subtle changes in her personality. She began to smile more, sometimes shyly, when he offered a small gift, a piece of bread, a hand-carved toy, or a flower from the garden. She laughed quietly at his stories about clumsy cattle and mischievous horses. She began to speak in English more often, repeating phrases she had learned and surprising John with her curiosity and quick mind. With each passing day, the walls around her heart seemed to crumble a little, replaced by trust and the beginnings of hope. Despite these small victories, John knew that Nina's journey was far from over. He had learned very little about how she had ended up in the pines, why she had been alone and injured, or what dangers might still exist. But he also knew that rushing her or forcing answers could undo all the progress they had made. Patience, care, and quiet presence were the tools he needed now, and he embraced this role fully. By the end of the second week, Nina was moving more confidently, exploring the ranch under John's watchful eye. She followed him on longer rides through the hills, learned the names of the horses and cattle, and began to participate in small tasks without fear. John watched her with pride and quiet relief, understanding that this was not just recovery, it was transformation. A frightened, injured girl was beginning to become a young, resilient, and hopeful individual, shaped not only by her past struggles, but also by the safety, trust, and kindness she had found on this ranch. And as the sun set on another day, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, John sat on the porch, watching Nina run lightly across the yard, her laughter carrying on the wind. He realized that their lives had already changed. What began as a moment of rescue had grown into something deeper, a connection, a bond, and the beginning of a journey neither of them could have anticipated. The quiet Harper Ranch had become a sanctuary, a place where trust could grow, fear could fade, and hope could be nurtured one careful, gentle step at a time. The days on the Harper Ranch continued to pass, and with each one, Nina became more comfortable in her new surroundings. The ranch, once a quiet and predictable place, was now filled with a gentle energy that seemed to flow from the bond between the young girl and the man who had rescued her. John Harper watched with quiet satisfaction as she moved with growing confidence, her small footsteps on the wooden floorboards no longer hesitant but purposeful. The forest surrounding the ranch became a favorite place for Nina. She would walk along the trails with John, exploring the shadows and sunlight that filtered through the tall pines. She loved to observe the animals, especially the deer that sometimes ventured near the edge of the pastures. John noticed how her eyes lit up with curiosity and wonder, and he realized that she was slowly reclaiming a sense of safety and joy that had been missing from her life. One afternoon, as they walked through a narrow path shaded by pines, John pointed out the different types of trees and plants. He showed her how to recognize the smell of pine needles and how to tell the age of a tree by its bark. Nina listened attentively, occasionally reaching out to touch a branch or examine a pinecone with a delicate curiosity. She asked questions in her quiet voice, and though John could not understand all of her words, he could sense the thoughtfulness behind them. Their communication had grown over time. While language remained a barrier, gestures, expressions, and the occasional word in English had begun to form a bridge. John would point to a bird and say, "Robin," and Nina would repeat the word softly. She started learning the names of the animals on the ranch, the tools used for farming, and even some basic words for everyday life. Each small victory in language brought a shared sense of achievement, and it strengthened the bond between them. As the weeks passed, John noticed another change in Nina. She began to share memories and feelings, though carefully and slowly. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she traced shapes in the dirt on the floor with a stick, showing images of mountains, a river, and a small group of people. John watched with gentle attention, understanding that these drawings were her way of communicating her past and the life she had left behind. He never asked questions too quickly, allowing her to reveal her story at her own pace. John also observed how Nina's resilience and courage began to shine through. She was learning to face small challenges with determination, whether it was climbing a hill, feeding the animals alone, or tending to her own needs without fear. There was still fragility in her movements, a hesitation born from past pain, but she no longer flinched at every sound or shadow. She had begun to trust that the world around her, at least in the Harper Ranch, could be safe. One night, the quiet intimacy of the ranch was interrupted by a sudden, fierce storm. The wind howled through the pines, and rain began to fall in heavy sheets, tapping loudly against the roof. Nina had never experienced a storm like this while feeling truly safe, and the sudden sounds frightened her. She pressed close to John, trembling, and he immediately wrapped his strong arms around her. "It's all right, Nina," he said softly. "I'm here. You're safe. Nothing can hurt you here." She clung to him tightly, her small body shaking. John remained calm, stroking her hair gently, speaking in soft tones to comfort her. He shared stories of storms he had seen in his youth, of how they would pass and leave the land nourished and renewed. Slowly, Nina's trembling began to subside, replaced by the realization that she could depend on someone else for protection. That night she fell into a deeper sleep than she had experienced in weeks, resting safely beside the warmth of the fire. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the ranch drenched but bright. Nina woke with a quiet confidence, her first words in English being "storm safe." John smiled, realizing that she was not only recovering physically but also learning to trust emotionally. This trust was the most important step in their journey, and it gave John hope for the future. As the days moved forward, John and Nina continued to explore the ranch together, venturing further into the hills and forests. They found a small creek, its water clear and sparkling in the sunlight, where Nina delighted in skipping stones and watching the tiny fish swim. She laughed openly, a sound that warmed John's heart, and for the first time he felt that she was not just surviving but beginning to live fully. Evenings were spent around the fire, where John taught Nina more English words, telling her stories about the land, the animals, and life on the ranch. She began to respond with curiosity, asking questions and attempting new words with growing confidence. They shared moments of quiet companionship, sitting together in the glow of the firelight, sometimes speaking, sometimes simply enjoying the presence of one another. One particular evening marked a turning point in their relationship. The moon had risen high in the sky, casting silver light over the ranch, and a cool breeze rustled through the trees. Nina, who had been hesitant in the past, approached John with a small bundle of pine cones she had collected. She handed them to him with a shy smile. "For you," she said softly, practicing her English. John accepted the gift with gratitude. "Thank you, Nina. These are beautiful." It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. Nina was beginning to express herself not just through actions but through thoughtfulness and emotion. She was learning that kindness could be shared, and that trust could lead to genuine connection. John felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that their bond had grown beyond caretaker and child, forming into something stronger: mutual respect, understanding, and companionship. However, despite the progress, John remained aware that Nina's story was not yet complete. He did not know where she had come from, who she had lost, or what dangers might still be waiting in the wider world. There were moments when shadows crossed her face, when she seemed lost in thought or overwhelmed by memories she could not yet share. John never pressed her for answers. He knew that true healing required patience, empathy, and time. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset, Nina leaned against John and whispered, "Safe here." The words were simple, but their meaning was profound. She had begun to trust that the Harper Ranch was a place where she could heal, where she could be herself without fear. John felt a surge of emotion, realizing that their journey together was more than recovery. It was the beginning of a bond that would shape both of their lives. As the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, John reflected on the changes he had witnessed. Nina had gone from a frightened, injured girl hiding in the pines to a child learning to walk confidently, speak in a new language, and trust in the kindness of another human being. The transformation was remarkable, and John understood that it was not just his care that had made the difference. It was the patience, understanding, and consistent presence that had allowed Nina to feel safe and valued. The night deepened, and the sounds of the ranch settled into a comforting rhythm. The cattle lowed softly in the distance, the wind whispered through the trees, and the gentle crackle of the fire provided warmth and light. Nina had fallen asleep nearby, her breathing steady and calm. John watched her for a moment, marveling at her resilience, and then looked out into the night, thinking about the future. He knew that their bond would face challenges, that questions about her past and her future would eventually arise. But he also knew that the foundation of trust they had built was strong enough to withstand whatever came next. In the quiet of the night, John realized that this chapter of their story, the days of healing, trust, and growing connection, was a turning point. It was a moment when fear had begun to be replaced by hope, and when a young girl who had known only pain and uncertainty could start to imagine a life filled with safety, friendship, and possibility. And as he sat there in the moonlight, he understood that their journey together was far from over, but it had already changed both of their lives in ways that would be remembered forever. The bond between John and Nina had deepened into something profound. It was no longer simply a matter of caretaker and child. It had grown into a partnership of trust, understanding, and shared experience. They had faced fear, injury, and uncertainty together, and in doing so, had forged a connection that would guide them through the challenges still to come. And so, as the Harper Ranch lay quiet beneath the night sky, the firelight flickering softly, Nina slept peacefully for the first time in many weeks. John sat nearby, keeping watch, filled with quiet hope. He knew that the days ahead would bring new trials, new discoveries, and new moments of joy. But he also knew that the bond they had formed would help them face anything together. The journey was only beginning, but the foundation was strong, built on patience, trust, and the courage to care for one another in a world that had not always been kind. The quiet peace of the Harper Ranch could not last forever. Weeks had passed since John had found Nina in the pines, and while her recovery and growing confidence brought light to the ranch, the outside world began to stir with questions. Word of the young Apache girl had reached neighbors, local authorities, and eventually members of her community. People were curious, concerned, and in some cases, worried about her sudden disappearance and the circumstances of her arrival at the ranch. John knew this day would come, and he had prepared himself mentally, but the reality of it was more complicated than he had imagined. One morning, as John worked repairing a fence near the northern pasture, he noticed a group of people approaching along the trail. They were cautious at first, keeping a respectful distance, but their presence was undeniable. Among them was a woman who John quickly recognized from the descriptions he had received, a relative of Nina's family. Her face was etched with worry and urgency, and though she spoke kindly, there was a tension in her voice that reflected the anxiety she carried. John greeted them calmly. "Hello," he said. "You must be looking for Nina. She's here safe." The woman nodded, her eyes scanning the ranch, taking in the house, the horses, and the fields. "We were very worried," she said. "We didn't know where she had gone. Is she hurt?" John gestured toward the house, where Nina was quietly observing the visitors from the doorway. "She had some injuries when I found her," he explained. "She's healing now and she's safe here. She's adjusting slowly, but she's strong." The family member approached cautiously, kneeling slightly to meet Nina's gaze. "Nina," she said softly, "we've been looking for you. We want you to come home." Nina froze. Her eyes widened and her small hands gripped the edge of the doorframe. She had spent weeks in safety, learning to trust John, exploring the ranch, and beginning to feel like she belonged. Now, confronted with the possibility of leaving this world behind, a flood of emotions washed over her: fear, uncertainty, and a longing for both the familiar and the safe. John stepped forward gently, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Nina," he said softly, "you have a choice. You can go with them or you can stay a little longer. I will support whatever you decide." The pause that followed was heavy with tension. Nina's gaze flicked between John and the woman from her family, and for the first time she tried to speak in English. "I scared," she whispered. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of everything she had experienced: the injuries, the fear, the loneliness, and the trust she had built with John. The family member nodded understandingly. "I know, Nina. We just want to make sure you're safe. But we will listen to you. We will not force you." The situation was delicate. John understood that he could not keep Nina indefinitely. Her roots, her family, and her community were calling her, and it was only natural for her to want to reconnect. At the same time, he could not ignore the attachment that had formed, the trust she had placed in him, and the sense of safety she felt on the ranch. He had to balance his role as caretaker with the reality that her life was bigger than the ranch alone. Over the next several days, John allowed the family to visit and interact with Nina under his watchful eye. He observed closely, careful not to intrude but ready to intervene if necessary. The meetings were a mixture of relief and tension. Nina would shy away at times, clutching John's hand, and at other moments she would tentatively respond to her relatives' questions. The family was patient, sensing her hesitation, and John encouraged them to move slowly, emphasizing the importance of trust and understanding. One afternoon, John decided to take Nina and a family member on a walk through the hills. The path wound through the pines, offering privacy and a sense of safety away from the eyes of others. He wanted Nina to see that she could reconnect with her people without feeling overwhelmed. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of pine and earth, and the gentle rustle of leaves created a soothing backdrop. As they walked, Nina began to open up more. She pointed to a small creek, mimicking the way she had taught John to skip stones, and the family member smiled, encouraging her gently. They began to talk about the forest, the animals, and the landscape, slowly bridging the gap between the world she had known and the new life she had begun to build. John remained close, offering quiet reassurance, understanding that this journey of reconnection required patience and care. But despite the progress, tension remained. Nina's trust in John had grown so deeply that the thought of leaving him, even temporarily, brought anxiety and fear. She had found safety and warmth in his presence, and the idea of returning to a life that had once been dangerous and uncertain was frightening. John noticed her hesitation, the way her small hands would cling to his, the slight tremble in her voice when the topic of leaving was raised. One evening, after a long day of walks and conversations, John and Nina sat outside, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and orange. He spoke softly, choosing his words carefully. "Nina, I know it's hard to think about leaving, but your family cares for you. You belong to both worlds now, the ranch where you're safe and your community where your people love you." Nina leaned against him, whispering, "I don't want hurt anyone." "You won't hurt anyone," John replied. "You can take your time. You don't have to make a decision tonight. What matters is that you know you are safe and that people care for you." That night, Nina slept with John nearby, her small body curled under the warmth of the blankets. For the first time, she allowed herself to rest without the fear that had haunted her for so long. John stayed awake, reflecting on the delicate balance he faced. He knew the moment of decision was approaching, and he could only hope that the trust they had built would guide her toward the choice that was right for her. The days that followed were filled with small steps toward understanding and reconnection. Nina began to participate more in conversations with her family, using the words she had learned from John to express her thoughts and feelings. She laughed quietly, shared memories through drawings, and even attempted to explain some of her experiences in the pines. Each moment was a step toward bridging the gap between the world she had left and the new life she had begun to build at the ranch. John continued to guide her gently, offering wisdom without pressure. He encouraged her to explore her feelings, to voice her fears, and to embrace the love and care around her. He understood that this was more than a choice between staying or leaving. It was a journey of self-discovery, trust, and courage. Nina was learning to navigate her emotions, to recognize her own strength, and to understand that she could be brave even in the face of uncertainty. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the pines, Nina approached John with a determined expression. She had spent time reflecting on her experiences, weighing the safety and comfort she had found on the ranch against her connection to her family and community. Her eyes, once filled with fear, now shone with quiet resolve. "I go home," she said softly, her words deliberate and measured. "But come back," John smiled gently, his heart swelling with pride and understanding. "Yes, Nina," he replied. "You can go home and you can always come back. This ranch will always be a place where you are safe and welcome." The family member nodded, embracing Nina carefully, understanding the depth of her attachment to the ranch and the man who had cared for her. It was a moment of relief and joy, tempered by the knowledge that change was difficult and that emotions would remain complex for some time. The following days were spent preparing for Nina's temporary departure. John worked alongside the family to ensure that she would travel safely, providing guidance, supplies, and reassurance. Nina helped pack her small belongings, her movements deliberate and thoughtful, showing both maturity and the confidence she had gained at the ranch. On the morning of her departure, John walked with her to the edge of the ranch, Rusty waiting patiently nearby. The sun rose over the hills, casting a golden light over the landscape, and the air was filled with a sense of transition, an ending, yes, but also a beginning. Nina hugged John tightly, pressing her small face against his chest. "Thank you," she whispered. John held her close for a moment longer, feeling the weight of all they had shared, the fear, the trust, the growth, and the connection that had transformed both their lives. "Take care, Nina," he said softly. "Be brave, and remember you are never alone." With a final wave, Nina left with her family, walking along the trail that would take her back to the community she had been separated from. John watched her go, his heart heavy yet full of hope. He knew that their bond would endure, strengthened by the trust, patience, and love they had built together. The Harper Ranch returned to its quiet routine, but it was forever changed. The experience had reminded John of the power of compassion, the importance of patience, and the profound impact that one life can have on another. And though Nina was no longer physically present, her presence lingered in the air, in the laughter that had filled the halls, and in the quiet knowledge that their lives had been irrevocably shaped by a single act of courage and kindness. The morning air was crisp as the sun rose. Over the Harper Ranch, painting the pines with a warm golden light. Birds sang from the treetops, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and earth. It was the day Nina would leave with her family, a day John had known would come, but one that still filled him with quiet worry. He had watched her grow from a frightened, injured girl into a confident, curious, and resilient young girl, and the thought of saying goodbye, even temporarily, brought a tightness to his chest. Nina moved carefully around the ranch, helping to gather small items for her journey. She packed the few belongings she had brought with her, along with the mementos she had found during her time at the ranch, small pine cones, a carved stick, and a drawing of the creek where she had learned to skip stones. Each item was a reminder of the time she had spent in safety, of the trust she had learned to place in John, and of the bond that had formed between them. John walked beside her, offering guidance and encouragement. "Remember, Nina," he said softly, "you are brave. You have learned so much, and this ranch will always be a place where you are safe and welcome." Nina nodded, her small hand gripping his tightly. Her eyes were wide, reflecting a mixture of fear and determination. She had learned to trust others, to navigate her emotions, and to understand that safety and kindness could coexist. But leaving the ranch and the man who had protected her would test all of that strength. As they reached the edge of the property, the family members who had come to escort Nina waited patiently. They smiled gently, understanding that this moment was significant for both Nina and John. The young girl took a deep breath, glancing back at the ranch one last time. She saw the house where she had found warmth and comfort, the fields where she had learned to care for the animals, and the trees where she had felt the quiet strength of nature. Each detail was etched into her memory, a part of her story that she would carry forever. Suddenly, a commotion erupted from the nearby forest. A horse, startled by a small animal darting across the path, bolted forward, its rider struggling to regain control. John's heart leaped. "Hold on, Nina," he shouted, moving quickly to help. The young girl froze for a moment, fear gripping her, but John's calm presence reassured her. He reached out, steadying the rider and guiding the horse back onto the path. Nina's eyes widened with relief, and she clutched his hand even tighter, realizing that danger could strike at any moment, but that she was not alone. The incident reminded John of the fragile balance between safety and uncertainty. He knew that Nina's journey was just beginning and that she would face challenges beyond the ranch. But he also understood that she had grown strong enough to handle them, with the lessons of trust, courage, and resilience she had learned during her time with him. Finally, the path was clear and Nina mounted the horse with the help of her family. John stood nearby, watching her adjust in the saddle. "Be safe," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And remember, you can always come back." Nina nodded, her eyes glistening with tears she did not yet allow to fall. She had learned so much in a short time, the value of kindness, the power of trust, and the strength that comes from facing fear with courage. And though she was leaving the ranch, she carried with her a sense of confidence and hope that would guide her in the days to come. As the family began their journey down the trail, John walked beside them for a short distance. They moved slowly, giving Nina time to adjust to the transition. She looked back frequently, her eyes meeting John's, silently expressing gratitude, trust, and a bond that words could not fully capture. The connection they had formed was profound, a shared experience that had changed both their lives. The trail wound through the pines, leading to the edge of the forest where the open landscape of her community awaited. Nina's pace was steady now, her fear tempered by the confidence she had gained. She understood that she could face the unknown because she had faced and overcome uncertainty before. John watched her, feeling a mix of pride, sadness, and hope. He knew this was not the end of their story, only a new chapter in a life that had been forever shaped by one night in the pines. That night, after Nina had safely reached her community, John sat alone by the fire in the ranch house. The room was quiet, the only sounds the crackle of flames and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. He reflected on the journey they had shared, the injuries, the fear, the slow building of trust, and the bond that had grown into something unbreakable. A single night, one act of courage and compassion, had changed everything. John realized that he had not only provided safety for Nina, but had also learned from her resilience, courage, and openness. The experience had reminded him of the power of human connection, of patience, and of the simple but profound impact that kindness can have on a life. He thought of Nina, imagining her safe, surrounded by her family, yet carrying the lessons, memories, and bond they had formed. In the days that followed, the ranch returned to its quiet routine, but the memory of Nina lingered in the air. John noticed the small pinecone she had left behind, the faint marks where she had practiced her drawing, and the subtle changes in the animals, who seemed to sense the calm and warmth she had brought. Every detail was a reminder that life is shaped not only by grand events, but by the quiet moments of trust, care, and connection. Word of Nina's safe return spread through the community. Those who had been worried were relieved, and John received messages of gratitude and respect for his actions. Yet, for him, the recognition mattered little. What mattered most was the knowledge that he had made a difference, that a young girl had been given a chance to heal, to trust, and to grow. Months later, Nina returned to the Harper Ranch for a visit. She had grown taller, stronger, and more confident. Her eyes still held the spark of curiosity and resilience, and her smile was brighter than ever. John welcomed her warmly, proud to see how far she had come. The bond between them had not weakened with time or distance. It had only deepened, strengthened by trust, shared experience, and the knowledge that one night in the pines had changed both their lives forever. Together, they walked through the forest, past the creek where she had skipped stones, and across the fields where she had learned to care for the animals. They laughed, shared stories, and marveled at the world around them, knowing that their connection was a source of strength and joy. The ranch, once simply a place of work and routine, had become a symbol of hope, resilience, and the transformative power of kindness. John watched Nina explore, remembering the day he had found her injured and alone. He marveled at the journey they had shared, the moments of fear, the slow building of trust, and the ultimate triumph of courage and connection. A single night had indeed changed everything, not just for Nina, but for himself as well. He realized that life's most profound changes often come unexpectedly, through small acts of care and understanding, and that the bonds we form in those moments can endure a lifetime. As the sun set over the Harper Ranch, casting long shadows across the fields and painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, John and Nina sat quietly together. They watched the world around them, feeling the warmth of friendship, the comfort of safety, and the strength of the bond that had grown between them. In that moment, everything felt right, balanced between the past, the present, and the possibilities of the future. And though the journey had been challenging, filled with fear and uncertainty, both John and Nina understood that it had been worth every moment. One night in the pines, an act of compassion, and the patience to nurture trust had changed everything. It had created a bond that would last a lifetime, a story of courage, resilience, and love that neither of them would ever forget. The Harper Ranch, quiet once again, seemed to hum with the memory of that transformative night. The pines whispered in the wind, the creek shimmered in the fading light, and the fields stretched wide and open, a reminder that life can be both fragile and strong, uncertain and full of hope. And in the heart of it all, the bond between a man and a young girl endured, a testament to the power of trust, patience, and the simple act of caring for another human being.